I'm really, really honored for this conversation. And thank you all so much for joining with us. Bryan Lee Jr. is somebody that I've been watching the work of for a really, really long time. And Colloqate Design is just doing incredible work. So it's an honor to have this conversation. Bryan Lee Jr. is an architect, activist, and a founder of the Spatial Design Justice Movement, dedicated to building power through the design of anti racist spaces of reparation and liberation. I'm going to say it again for the people in the back: building power through the design of anti racist spaces of reparation and liberation, expanding community access to the design of social, civic, and cultural spaces, and challenging the systems of power they use architecture as a tool of oppression. Oppression. How you doing, Bryan?
I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna hand over to you, and we'll have a conversation later on. So everyone, please feel free to add your comments and thoughts as we move through in the chat, and we'll make time for a discussion towards the end. But Bryan, go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much. So I just want to thank the My Team and everyone in the audience for coming today. I really do appreciate having the space to vibe with people who are thinking about the ways in which we can use design or art or kind of our cultural means to influence just outcomes in the built environment or in our communities and neighborhoods more broadly. So again, thank you for having me. So again, we're going to talk about power and place today. This is a conversation that deals with the poles of supremacy and mutualism. And so when we talk about that, we're talking about supremacy finding singularity and mutualism finding plurality, and supremacy finding entropy and mutualism finding coalescence. We're talking about supremacy finding proclamation as a sense of power, and mutualism finding narrative. Ultimately, when we talk about white supremacy, we're talking about fission. We're talking about power that is formed regardless, but that is formed through the immense separation of people, right? The immense separation of individuals. Mutualism is a form of fusion. It is four times as powerful as fission, but it requires so much more, so many more people to kind of come together in that work. And so, as we go through this keynote, I want you to kind of keep those ideas centered as we talk through the relationships between power and place. So again, I run a small practice called Colloqate Design. It is the kind of form of colloquialism and location. It is formally about or it is fundamentally about the sophisticatedly informal use of formal architectural design, planning language of place. So it is the language of place, and how do we understand the language of a particular place? On top of that, when we think about the word co-locate, it is talking about the sequence of words and phrases habitually juxtaposed with one another at a greater frequency than chance. So our firm name is sampled off of that in a sense, the sequence of people and place habitually juxtaposed at a greater frequency than chance. What we're talking about are the patterns, the routines, the habits that are formed as a result of our cultural considerations for place. If we understand those, we can actually amplify them to maintain, hold, and build power in communities. And so, as I said, we pull with these three kind of connotations or three kind of starting points: power, values, and care. Right? Power. Malcolm X talked about in the speech to the grassroots in 1963 that the history of all revolutions is based on blood and land. It is about the landless versus the landlord, and the pursuit of any independence without love lost, without compromise, without negotiation. So when we're talking about what revolutions look like, because we often use this language of revolution and liberation, and we're not necessarily always in the same space to be able to do that. And the reason Malcolm says is that we're not ready to bleed. Now, he meant it literally, but both literally and metaphorically, we're not willing to sacrifice. And what sacrifice means is different for everybody in every different space. But in order to do this work, there is a level of sacrifice that's necessary to pursue it. values. Now, our values, our collective values, are validated through the spaces and places we design. And in racist systems, which we all operate within, we create monuments to the hubris of white supremacy through the built environment. And what we literally mean by that is ego drives buildings and spaces to proclaim their dominance over oppressed people, period. It's how the entirety of our landscapes have been designed. And so when we recognize that, and then we recognize what we have to do, the small little stones we have to put back into our public spaces, into our housing, into our greater kind of cityscapes, to dignify the humanity of those who exist within those spaces, we can recognize that our values must be a part of that design and not a secondary or tertiary consequence. And then lastly, care. None of this works without care for a beloved community. So design justice, when we talk about design justice is what love looks like in public spaces. This is a crib from Dr. Cornell West. Justice is what love looks like in public. And I want us to kind of fully sit with the idea that in order to love a people, in order to love a space that is in relationship to those people, we have to be a part of a community. That doesn't mean that we can't just drop in. We can't just be superficial kind of entities within a space. We have to actually be in relationship with one another in order to form justice and liberation. So for nearly every injustice in this world, there is an architecture, a design, a plan that forwards or sustains that injustice. And so when we talk about spatial design justice, we are looking at how we forward a radical anti-racist vision for racial, social, and cultural reparation through the process and outcomes of design. It is fundamentally about, when we talk about radical, let's say radical because we're trying to get to the root of an issue. Radical just means radish. It is the etymology of the word is very simple. Get to the root of a particular issue. When we talk about reparation, it's an acknowledgement that every bit of our work is about healing and repair. Right? You can't move forward unless you heal and repair. And then we say process and outcomes because it is not sufficient to just simply show a piece of work that has no grip on reality, that is not sought to dig into the roots in a true way. It requires a process. It requires a conversation. It requires us to be in communication with the community that we are attempting to address or work with or work within. And then lastly, again, design justice seeks to challenge the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a tool of oppression. So much of what we talk about in our work is how we mitigate harm, and that's absolutely important. Um, but the only way that we're able to get to speculative futures, the only way that we're actually able to get to spatial imagination is if we are challenging the kind of predispositions of history that tell us that we are not worthy of being occupants of this space together, right? So I want to just kind of talk briefly about the organizing work that we've done over the course of the last uh, 5, 6 years, but have culminated over the last 6 months. Um, so Design as Protest is an act of hundreds of people across the country, in the United States and across the world, some in the UK, who have come together to determine what are the prevailing narratives of movements across the country that have spatial implications by their very nature, and how might we apply our work to that as artists, as designers, as planners, so on and so forth. How do we divest from police and reinvest in communities? How do we end the carceral state writ large? What are our defensible tactics that we can abolish from our design work? How do we enhance community self-determination, preserve and invest in Black cultural spaces and cultural spaces writ large? How do we redefine what just neighborhoods look like, shift public policies around public space, reimagine new financial structures that allow us to incorporate ourselves into the structure of neighborhoods in a real way that does not subject us to the whims of gentrification, that does not subject us to the whims of displacement? And then how do we radically change how we teach one another? How do we radically think about pedagogy as a tool for liberation? And that requires us to be practical about what we're attempting to do. Is our work a form of outreach? Is it a form of engagement? Is it a form of organizing? We, as a practice, and we as a collective, center ourselves on organizing with a bias towards action. And what that means is we are strategically mobilized to build power through the work that we do, both social and political power that redistributes whatever we have back into communities, period. It is a community building process, whether it's architecture, whether it's a plan, whether it's a piece of art. It is all about how we connect back to a community and build some version of power. It might be small, it might be large, but all of it's valuable if we're moving towards power building in space. So I want to pull to a moment because um, in the last month, we've seen something incredible happen in the United States. A shroud of decency has been lifted, and the kind of clear, uh, kind of unabashed, harmful elements of white supremacy have been laid bare in our cities, specifically in DC. But over the last 6 months, we've seen a lot of this. Now, part of this is that we have to understand what the difference between protest, rebellion, riot, and insurrection are. We often negate these, and we talk about design as a form of protest for a reason. Because design is to protest is to have an unyielding faith in the power of a just society. It is fundamentally about our deep expression of care and a deep expression of collective hope for the communities that we work within. It is nothing more than an expression of love made public over and over and over again. Whether it's determined or silent or a die in, it does not matter. It is all a part of people describing power, right? That is our job, is to make clear what power is doing to its people, right? And so that is often conflated with riot. So riots are political and legal terms. And so our job is to make clear that when police or when politicians use the term riot, they recognize that nearly, at least in the States, nearly every riot you know of that started in this country from its origins um, was preceded by Black Death or Brown Death, every single one. And I presume that as you look across the world, you start to see very similar conditions. Those who are most marginalized, those who are always harmed, are the ones that are consistently harmed before the term riot is deployed against people in protest. Insurrection. Insurrection is the most recent thing that we've seen, but it is not recent to the history of our world. It is power challenging power, it is power trying to usurp one another. And that in itself is the destruction of a democracy. But it is also not the same thing as protest or rebellion. And that needs to be made clear. It needs to be made clear that protest and rebellion are forms of expression that are actively seeking to change the world for the betterment of the people we serve. Now, can architecture be a part of that conversation? Can design, can planning, can art be a part of that conversation? We know art has always been a part of that conversation. It is about the scale and continuity that starts to build that. So, I want to talk a little bit about what we are afraid of. What are we afraid of? Fear drives so much of our decisions. It's the fear of harm, fear of shame, fear that drives us to make plans with one another, to bias ourselves to protect our families. Fear drives a lot of what we do. But in racist systems, again, we talked about this earlier, we build monuments to the hubris of white supremacy. And so fear gives us the gateway to do so. We are afraid that if we are not acting in accordance, we are a part of that system. And we are a part of racist systems because the systems were built to oblige us. And so we have to be anti-racist in the work that we do because we have obligations to one another to acknowledge the racialized and socialized biases that work in systems. And then we have to seek to dismantle them through whatever means we have. And in order to do that, we have to recognize what racism is versus what a racist is. You see, systems rely on unconscious cultivated bias. They rely on us to not, to easily allow for the system to operate because it makes our lives easier. So whether we are members of the Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, and plus kind of community, we need to understand that the systems are still built for us to reinforce white supremacy. And so in that recognition, then pulling the fact that all of these forces, racism is one force, there's ableism, genderism, I'm sorry, sexism, all of these things that continue to apply a force to a people, they are intersectional by their very nature. Everyone on this call, everyone in this keynote is a amalgamation of various identities, right? We are all a system of various identities, and these forces apply to various communities. And so when a force is applied to a collective body, that body has to respond in one way or another. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but ultimately that's what forms our culture. And so if we're not careful, if we're not understanding that the forces that we apply that are power in their very nature that apply to communities shapes our culture, we don't understand that the prevailing environmental, geographic, social, political forces uh, are the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate condition. So the key point here is that culture is a collective coping mechanism. Culture is a necessary trauma response. And so in our work as artists, as designers, as architects, as planners, um, we have to recognize that culture is the binding agent that allows us to do our work with an efficacy that builds power and that builds community um, in that work. Now, lastly, I'll stop talking here after this. I mean, but I want us to kind of center our last kind of conversation on status quo to liberation. We often are not familiar or we conflate words, and we've seen a lot of people work towards equality and equity over the last 10 years. That's been the kind of prevailing kind of capital driven narrative. If we seek those two things, we can still have good business. We don't have to be anti-racist. You know, black and brown people won't yell at us anymore, and we'll be good to go. Yeah, well, that's bullshit. So we have to then recognize that injustice is simply a way of making systems imbalanced to deny resources in order to extract, maintain, or retain power for a particular set of people, usually power begetting power. On the other end of that spectrum, if we are actually seeking justice, then we have to repair for past injustices. We have to make fair in the present or stabilize. We have to then remove barriers to progress. And if we actually want to get to liberation, it's the hardest thing we're going to ever have to do. We actually have to affirmatively influence future outcomes. And so, in whatever way we can as designers, use our work to liberate people, to find 1 ounce of affirmative influence in the outcomes of people's lives. I propose to you that that's what we do. I propose to you that that's how we frame our work and frame our lives through a lens of design justice. It asks us to uh, acknowledge that there are histories of violence that are both acute and obtuse. Uh, uh, the way in which spatial violence exists now may not look like it did in the 60s. I often show this picture of Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, who's integrating schools in Alabama, um, with the same visceral anger, right? You do not belong here. That's what these spaces tell us. Now, whether that's an individual yelling at us or it's the signs that tell us that in earnest, they are prevailing. But we have to remember that revolutions happen through the claiming of space. So whatever space you exist within, claim it. Claim it, because the revolution doesn't happen without us. So culture is that evolution. Culture is that revolution. And I ask all of you to lean into the spatial design justice, lean into design justice, lean into artistic justice, cultural justice, whatever frame that you need to move forward towards a liberatory practice, do that. And we are all here on the lines with you. Thank you very much.
You know, you're like, I was like here applauding, and I'm like, but we're not really together in physical space, and I'm on mute. You just can't see, you know. Like, I think by now we'll be used to where we are.
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
Thank you so much for sharing that, for sharing your work. Something that really, really struck me. I mean, I said in the chat, but like you just dropped mics like as soon as you came in. Like, give us a second. Sipping our tea, like give us a second. But something that really struck me was this shift from looking at equity as the end goal. Like we're so far beyond that as the need, and in many ways it feels like, I mean, I'm speaking from my experience here, but um it feels like some of us, most of us are zooming in from the UK, but it feels like even equity is like we're not even there yet. We're not even acknowledging that that's where we need to be. Our country are still operating with like diversity and inclusion,
yeah, yeah,
tactics and strategies. And it's like, what exactly are you expecting people to be included into? Like, what
yeah,
systems and environments and cultures and places are you inviting people to be included into? Like, we're
yeah.
still there. And so, anytime that there's quite a few people on this Zoom call and who have been part of the spatial imagination that are invested in this liberation, like, intentionally, practically, um, and are seen as like, the weirdos, the outcasts, the
Yeah, the
random
agitators.
people over there doing that strange thing. Like, how is that something that you're even within a country that is maybe slightly more ahead in its like public conversation? Are those still things that you're like, we're still having to make the case that liberation is the thing?
Mhm.
Is the,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so we are. I don't know that we're slightly more ahead. I would say that I surround myself with people who are way in front on purpose, because we iron sharpens iron, and we're supposed to kind of build on one another. But we're still having a conversation. We have this kind of cheeky conversation around the term Jedi, which is justice and equity before diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion is an outcome, right? If you don't make just spaces, if you're not making equitable spaces, you will never get diversity and inclusion. So ultimately, that is the conversation that we've tried to frame. And I generally just yell in those rooms, F diversity and inclusion, because it is ultimately not a um, you can't say you want to score. I mean, this probably won't land, but you can't say you want to score a touchdown um, before going through all of the plays, right? Like you can't do that. That's not how it works, right? You can't score a goal in soccer maybe before.
that's
I
more
don't
like
know. You get it. You get the point. You can't score the goal.
we're with you on the
Yeah,
gist.
yeah. You understand. And so the idea is just simply that, if you're seeking only the goal, you will do whatever it takes to have the semblance of that goal as valuable, rather than doing any of the hard work between point A and point Z to get there. And so justice and equity are the only ways to diversity and inclusion, and we have to say that in every single room that we're in, or else we'll never get to justice, and let alone get to freedom and liberation.
Mm. There's the I remember one of the first I think it's one of the first projects, or definitely the one that spoke to me really early on when I came across your work was paper monuments.
Yeah.
And I feel like, globally there's been a conversation about monuments more than ever. Of course, we're seeing statues, we're seeing symbols being removed, torn down in the US. In Here in the UK, it started to happen as well. We had incidents in Bristol, in Liverpool, and around the country. And I'm saying that really aware that this was a conversation about monuments that you've been having for a really long time.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you can talk us through just your observations from, from the beginning of your design justice work, and I guess imagination work around,
Yeah.
what are we documenting, what are we archiving, who are we elevating and championing to where we
Yeah.
are now.
Yeah, absolutely. I was on a call with Mayor Reese in Bristol yesterday, actually, to talk specifically about this subject. And I think, my history around monuments and memorials. So we see them as a continuum, right? We see these things as mandalas, or from the ephemeral to the permanent. The mandala, the marker, the monument, the memorial, the museum, and anything along that continuum allows us to recognize ourselves, or recognize the kind of antithesis to ourselves in public space. And so ultimately our conversation uh, started with a diversity set of conversations. I worked on a project in 2007 that was specifically about um, the African American Museum in DC before it was built. This was David Ajay and Phil Freelon and Max Bond and the like. And really what we wanted to do was try to understand the kind of cultural imagination that they were putting into a new space that was specifically about a history of blackness in the country. And I think what I recognized very early on was that um, even in stories and narratives of communities of color, whiteness is always forwarded and centered. And so what you see in the monuments conversation is this global need to elevate and lionize whiteness, regardless of its supremacist faults, right? And I often ask white people in those conversations, do y'all not just know any good white people? Like, I know there are good white people out there in the world. Can you just point to one and put a monument up to that particular person? Better yet, don't put monuments up to single people. Put monuments up to movements and collectives and events and movements, because ultimately uh, nothing is done by individuals, and individuals reinforce the notion of supremacy as singular in its nature. And so, yeah, the monuments conversation has always been one that has extended beyond just the object in the field for me, and really been a conversation of both monuments as buildings all the way to monuments as moments in time. As an artist and as an architect, I see them both as valuable, and we have to change narratives through all of the means in order to move forward. It's almost what's the kind of communist manifesto, which is talking about control the means of production. We have to control the cultural means and the artistic means of production, and make sure that it is in align with a mutualistic um, notion moving forward.
Mm. There's there are a few comments in the chat that I would love to come to as well. It feels in many ways that I love what you talked about, this idea of you know monuments going from like this singular into collective, like a celebration, amplification of movements and all that that encompasses. And in many ways, I mean, I'm let me be frank. In the UK, we are like we're talking from like the hotbed of empire, like we are
Mm.
one of the originators
Yeah,
of this harm. By we I mean where we are.
yeah,
And so this idea of even singularity is a thing that is still championed, it's still elevated. That is the marker of success.
yeah,
Like even you have collectives, it's like no, I want that singular, the leader, that like
yeah.
with there. And how one of the comments in the conversation is speaking about integrating colonial past into education, and our museums play into this. Like our museums are celebrating harm, like
Hmm.
centuries and centuries of harm, and they and monuments are celebrated in that way. And you know, in a UK context, museums are then sites of worthy of celebration. And so, like, some people in this chat, some people beyond this chat are trying to do that work from internally. Like, let me go and try and change make within. What are your thoughts on that? And I know that's a massive question.
Yeah. You know, it's a great question, because I think in the same way that we don't want to silo um, narratives of place, we don't want to silo the methodologies by which we challenge and dismantle. Someone said to me a few months ago during a conversation, it's like you're trying to burn down the building or burn down the car. And said, no, actually, what we're trying to do is know the car so well that we can pull it apart piece by piece. So that means you actually have to, some people have to be inside. Some people have to understand how the mechanics work. Some people have to be on the outside to pull the car apart when it needs brute force. So there's a whole system of movement power that actually has to be aligned as well. So it is, you know, we often talk about that the activists give voice to the pain and the hurt and the harm that's on the ground, that is then responded to by advocates that understand the policies that create that harm, and then those advocates are pushing policymakers to change policies that alleviate some of that harm, and the cycle goes on and on and on. And so the idea is to make sure that people, even within systems, understand the systems well enough that even if they're not able to change it within the space, they can diagram it, they can describe it. I can describe to you what a system is, then damn, the people on the ground have that much more information to be able to work from. The advocates have that much more information to work from. I can tell you one quick story, that I worked for the city of New Orleans as a quasi-governmental agency in the Arts Council of New Orleans for 3 years. The first call I got, now mind you, my name is Bryan Lee Jr. The one statue in our city is Robert E. Lee, and so as a Black man, the assumption is that there's some relationship between the slave owner that stands on high in the middle of our city and me in some capacity. And I don't I never did the research. I don't know that, but it's a effed up solution, or proposition to ask somebody. And so I got that quite a bit as I worked for the city. The first call I got when I worked for the city was, "Can you take care of these monuments? Will you invest capital from your organization or from your department to invest in protecting these racist monuments?" And of course, we said no. But one of the things that we recognized in that initial process was that there's a difference between policies and procedures. There's a difference between maintenance and like who has ownership, not just ownership within a city, but who actually is supposed to take care of these pieces. And we can use all of these tactics as activists, as organizers, to call attention to particular moments where we can pull these things down. If there is no maintenance budget, then some of these things can come down easier. If there is no, right, like we can use these tactics and tools to change narratives and to build capacity across the board. So that's what I would say is, like, if you're internal, yes, use that, describe the system, take notes, make sure that those notes are available, don't get yourself in trouble, and make sure that they're shared broadly so that people can start to act on them.
So I'm gonna I'd love to hear anybody else's questions, any other comments. If you're not comfortable taking your mic off, by all means add them to the chat, and I'll share. Does anybody have a question in the immediate?
Potentially. I love, okay, yeah, AJ, welcome everyone, and thank you for holding this space, and like, just amazing to like get sparked like this. One question I had was around when you said culture as revolution. In this state, in this present moment, a lot of our culture right now is being commercialized in many ways, used to bring forth and like be symbolic in so many situations. How do you now balance that culture as revolution and culture as commercialism in this way? Because I always get afraid of, like, yeah, that dilution that happens when something so powerful then becomes a mean of consumption rather than something that gets activated. So I just wanted to get your thoughts.
Yeah, it is a um, it is a constant battle in systems of capitalism in which everything can be commodified, even revolution and even culture. And so I think the biggest problem that we face in revolution based movements or liberatory movements is simply that it requires it requires implicit and active community building, and in that you're connecting with so many people that um, that that a superficial understanding of what the revolution or what that liberatory practice is will ultimately always lead to a commercial or a yes, to a commercial means, and that is a byproduct of the larger, broader system that we exist within. So I think it is inevitable and has to be mitigated. But in large part, a lot of folks, it's why so many movements are very insular, but have that start to pull people in various ways. And I think you look at the organizations who have done it really well. BLM has a cultural minister, and so they control the cultural output. They don't just control the cultural output; they control who is able to engage with that cultural output, right? So do the Black Panthers. So does La Raza. So does a lot of these. Again, I'm giving you state based organizations. Forgive my ignorance, please. But I do think that the control of the means of culture is absolutely necessary to control the narratives, and control of narrative is absolutely important in movement work, because so much of what um, uh, what we have to deal with is culture butting up against propaganda. This is what we talked about protest versus riot earlier, right? Like riot is legal and political as much as it is propaganda, right? Like it is an immediate lie. It is a precursor to a lie, right? And so we have to just recognize that there is a need to maintain and keep culture within a certain frame, and then allow for prepare for the kind of propaganda that will continue to infiltrate larger, ever increasing movements.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
I think that's something that's very powerful. I know, like AJ, for example, is building incredible space, Barking and Dagenham. What do you call it? The sexiest place on the planet. And there's something about the space creation, and I know lots of people on this call are actively invested in that. Something that's on my heart is like how much we have to come to peace with the fact that our movements, our work, our spaces, I think Deborah's put in the conversation, liberated spaces can become gentrified. And I think for so long I've been working in opposition, like, let me be anti-gentrification, let me try and stop, like, let me do this, as opposed to how I show up different when I'm pro something, like when I am pro-Black and I encourage other people to be pro-Black, that shifts the dynamic of the work. It shifts how I show up. It shifts how my energy is contributed to a thing. And also, because spirituality keeps coming up throughout our conversations, is that even when people co-opt, exploit, take, imitate, whatever, they never quite get the soul of the thing. They never get that spiritual level. And that's something that we talk about it and we acknowledge its power, but it's so powerful because that's something that can never go with it. And I feel like I feel it's on my heart to say, like, even that, you know.
Yeah, yeah. There's an authenticity that comes with a lived experience, that comes with kind of a prevailing experience for a community of people. So when we talked about the forces applying to particular people and culture being created, that means that you've lived every single day of your life with a particular prevailing circumstance. And those who try to co-opt a moment like that haven't lived a single day with that fear or with a particular circumstance that drives them to make a particular decision. And so it's very easy from a language standpoint to understand that this is not their first language, so to speak, quote unquote, right? And so it's easy to spot, and then I think ultimately it requires us to to be comfortable then challenging. And I think, Amar, you said it really well. We are predisposed as designers to and artists to be to seek prototypian futures, because we believe that whatever pen goes to paper, it will create something that brings joy to people, that brings love, that brings care, that brings value, that brings power. And then we have to just acknowledge that that is a predisposition that we will always, as this collective, as this group, will always kind of forward.
Anyone else got any questions or comments or reflections? Please share, because y'all know I could talk forever. I think Julian's put in the conversation, it would be amazing to hear more about what radical change in design education looks like to you, how we can apply this across art and political education as insiders to a cultural sector in the UK. Is suffering from commercialization and state intervention, for example, anti-capitalist and Black Lives Matter education, is considered extremist here?
It baffles my mind. Like when I hear stuff like that, it means that they've literally never read a single thing from Black Lives Matter, or they've never read a like literally we've got movements that just say, hey, we want to feed people. Hey, people just deserve health care and need a place
Oh
to
my
sleep.
God, no.
Oh my God. Like, what the F is wrong with y'all? Like, how is that possible that you see this as a, but it's not the again, the output that they're worried about. They're worried about power being redistributed to Black and brown faces. And then ultimately, what will they do with that power? So if you get healthcare and you're healthy, if you have a house and you can live and exist in dignity, if you can eat food on a consistent basis, what will you do with this power? What will you do with it? That's what they're worried about. They're not worried about whether or not we can. I mean, these are obstacles that prevent. Yes, it is the fear. It is the fear that once communities that have historically been oppressed have a sense of power about them through these other tools. Once they've been through all of the barriers, we've knocked through all of these barriers, that there may be some retribution. I think that's ultimately at the core of the fear, is that we've done something to Black and brown people and Asian people for hundreds and hundreds of years. There's no way that they're not going to harm us if they get the power. That's the thing. But that is a fundamental kind of misrecognition of what mutualism and communities who are particularly collectivists as a culture, what they are and what we are. And so I just would say that, you know, yeah, we've got to think about our kind of pedagogical leanings in a way that is expansive, that does not narrow what specialist means. We hire a group of folks called community design advocates on all of our architecture projects, because what that means is that we are expanding the scope of who gets to talk about architecture, whether it's the formerly incarcerated person who's on the restorative justice facility project, whether it's the homeless person or the person who is houseless, who is on a shelter project. These people who have lived experience. So when we talk about radically changing what education and pedagogy looks like, it is not centered on school. It is centered on learning and knowledge sharing and teaching wherever people may be. If that means that we got to go in the hood and teach, we in the hood and we teach. If that means that we got to go underneath the freeway or the highway and teach and work with those who are houseless, then that's where we got to be. And so I think when we rethink education from a design perspective, it means that we are in different spaces and we were opening up different conversations and teaching people how to see what the spatial implications of their current experiences are and how they can apply.
That thing, isn't it? What can't be understated is proximity, and how hard, proximity, the definitions are constantly transforming as we navigate a coronavirus world and a digital age. It's ever changing. Proximity nonetheless cannot be understated. Hazel offers some thinking about being pro rather than anti. thinking about the relationship between hope and fear. Hope and dreaming can be scarier than continuing how things are. How do you cope with knockbacks when you're hoping so radically? How do you avoid burnout, just being so tired? And I would also like to just add to that as well. What brings you joy, like deep, guttural, like in your
Yeah.
spirit joy?
Yeah, that's good. This is like, so I answer the first one, and then I'll get to the kind of larger conversation. I mean, I think the joy part of it comes, for me, it comes from creating in community. So it's less about me sitting as a lonely artist painting on a canvas. And some people, that's like that's the essence of how they feel joy, and that's great. For me, it is creating something together, um, to see the light in people shine as something gets pulled together, is really really inspiring to me. And so I try to frame pretty much every project we do through the lens that uh, the communities we serve are active participants in the art, active participants in the struggle, and we will kind of push things forward through that. So that's what brings me joy. I mean, I think from the coping with knockbacks, whew, that's that is that is the hardest thing we will always face, because emotionally, this work is so daunting and so hard, and the mountaintop is always um, uh, a distance away, that it requires that community. I say community a lot here, but it requires us to be in community with people, so that when I can't stand anymore, I have a shoulder to lean on. When other folks are struggling to understand a particular part of the puzzle, there are multiple people who can back that person up, right? I think we have to be able to lift the weight off of one another, so that we can provide and clear more space for people to have that joy, to maintain their hope, to take a break and heal, right? As I mentioned earlier, there's a need to sacrifice in this, but sacrifice only works on a continual basis when there are people around you to let you heal from whatever harm is a byproduct of that sacrifice. If you are injured, or and Omar, you've been through this recently, like you've had this group of people who have supported you in this space, and so many of us have had that. Um, and so I think that's where it lies for me. I went through a 3 year bout, and I try to say this openly. Um, I went through a couple year bout with depression, and being able to speak about that publicly, and being able to have people who recognize my humanity regardless of the state that I'm in, even when I'm being more of an ass because I I'm going through a particular thing in life, is extremely important. So I think hope is also a byproduct of community empowerment, community building.
Very powerful. It's a very powerful idea. Um, and thank you so much for sharing that with us in the space.
Yeah.
My heart is so full and I've got so many more questions, but I would love to like round things off with this. So you're in New Orleans, right? You're based
Yes.
there?
Yes.
What are you
Based in New Orleans. Yeah.
excited for? Like what's coming up in your sphere? What's on your periphery that's like, yeah, I want to get to that. I can't wait for this.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that, so I'm teaching a studio this year, at Harvard, that is about, it's called the Black New Deal, and this studio is centered on um, cultivating the various movements of the last 150 plus years, and setting up essentially a Freedmen's Bureau, which our Free People's Bureau, which essentially says, we are creating a uh, series of policies and procedures that support the relief of Black, Indigenous, and disinherited communities. And so the idea is that our students And hopefully then beyond that, a larger set of people engage in this conversation around imagining the other side of freedom, imagining the other side of liberation. What happens when everything we've been fighting for is a go? What happens when they say, yeah, okay, you're right, let's abolish prisons altogether? What do we do? What do we do when we win? And I think that's what I'm excited about. I'm excited about imagining what happens when we win, because if we don't have a roadmap to get to the other side of liberation, then we will perpetually create a activist industrial complex in which we are angry, we go protest, nothing changes, we are angry, we go like it just we have to be able to see something in order to get there. And I'm excited about building that out.
I'm so, you got me ready. We're all
Let's
coming,
go.
coming to the other side.
Hey, look, we there too. So like this is an international movement. Let's continue to build there and here.
Absolutely. And you know already, like as soon as it's safe to travel, we're gonna, get you over here, come and hang with us, come and like you meet all
Yeah,
these incredible people in the
yeah.
conversation as well. And but just thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for your work. Like what a wow. Thank you so much everyone for being with us for this incredible session. Please keep in touch. It's amazing to see the chat really alive. TSI 2021, hashtag TSI 2021. Please keep the conversation going. But for now, Bryan, I don't think there could have been a better time for this conversation. So thank you so much for what you
Thank
shared.
you. Thank you so much for having me. I want to place this last little thing in the chat for everybody. The DAP Collective is international, and we actively want folks from across the world to join us in this movement. So there's hundreds and hundreds of us, both thinking about architectural education and design justice pedagogy, as well as a bias towards action through design as protest. Please join us, and I look forward to meeting and being with everybody in this movement moving forward. So thanks again.
Oh, thank
Appreciate
you
it.
so much. Thank
All
you.
right, y'all. Yeah, be safe.